In this video, we're going to be going over the top 10 best spell ruler cards to be released. If you have not done so already, make sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe if you would like to see more future videos. So number 10 on this list goes to Rush Recklessly, and an honorable mention to the Reliable Guardian because it is similar, but Rush Recklessly is honestly just overall better and more widely used. So Rush Recklessly is a quick play spell card that says that you get to target one monster on the field and it gains 700 attack. Now that alone might not seem like a lot because initially you might think, well, why not just use an equipped spell card like, Axe of Despair or something that grants more attack? Well, despite it being only an effect that lasts until the end of the turn, the fact that it's a quick play spell card actually makes it so amazing. You can chain it in so many different parts of a duel, including during the battle step, that honestly, it's just downright so flexible and amazing. If your opponent attacks into something that's weaker than their monster, you can just chain this if you actually have it set. Because it's a spell card, you can also just activate it on your own turn if you were to draw it. That way you don't have to wait a turn as if it was a normal trap card instead. If this card was a normal trap card that had the same effect, the card would not be anywhere near as useful, simply because it loses its flexibility and versatility. Quick play spell cards are honestly one of the most amazing types of cards in the entirety of the TCG because, once again, the flexibility is just unmatched in most cases, aside from of course monster quick effects, which are honestly also amazing in so many ways. But all of these reasons are just honestly why Rush Recklessly is just simply that good of a card, and that's why it's number 10 on this list. Number 9 on this list goes to UPSTART Goblin. So UPSTART Goblin is a significantly nerfed version of Pot of Greed, and even though it's significantly nerfed, the card is still so good that it's actually limited, and throughout history, it's actually been going back from limited to semi, back to limited, to the point where it's just so crazy that this card is actually limited, but there's a good reason why, just simply because that's the way Yu-Gi-Oh! Works as opposed to other card games when it comes to drawing cards. You see, the effect of UPSTART Goblins is that you get to draw one card, but your opponent gains 1000 life points. Compared to Pot of Greed, obviously the card lets you draw one additional card and there's no gaining 1000 life points for your opponent. That card is obviously banned, and for good reason, but UPSTART Goblin is limited as of now, and also for good reason. You see, if you run 3 UPSTART Goblins, you essentially have a 37 card deck as opposed to 40, with your opponent having 11,000 life points as opposed to 8,000 life points. Now that might seem a little balanced, but honestly it's not. If you actually have less cards in your deck, it's actually much more advantageous than giving your opponent 3,000 extra life points. You see, giving your opponent life points is one of the, I guess, not so bad effects in terms of costs, because it's not that big of a deal if you give your opponent 3,000 starting life points. After all, if you can actually overwhelm your opponent with the field by essentially utilizing your less total cards by using 3 UPSTART Goblins, it doesn't matter if they have 3,000 more life points or 5,000 more life points or so on and so forth, because you're going to overwhelm them regardless. Number 8 on this list goes to Cyberjar. So Cyberjar is a card that when it first came out was very interesting for sure, but in many ways there weren't really a huge amount of ways to actually abuse the card. However, over a span of several years later, it was very obvious that because of the nature of the card game and exactly where it was heading, effects like Cyberjar were just going to be way too broken. You see, Cyberjar has a flip effect, and when it flips, both players pick up, or excavate nowadays, the top 5 cards of their decks, and they special summon the level 4 or lower monsters onto the field, and then all of their cards get to go to the hand. It's a card that can generate so much comeback ability and potential that it's just way too cheap and broken. You see, on any flip, whether it's waiting for your opponent to flip it or you flip it up with a card effect, you can generate so much hand advantage in so many ways because in most cases, you're actually going to be the one benefiting from it. You see, if you flip the card, obviously it's going to be your main phase, which means that you can extend your play so much with all the cards that you just summoned or added to your hand. But if it's on your opponent's turn, during the battle phase, which is the most common way that an opponent can flip up a flip effect monster, it means that yes, even though they get to summon some more cards and add more cards to their hand, they can only do it in main phase 2, which means they can't use all those combos to then go into the battle phase and try to OTK you. However, you are going to be fresh for your draw phase, with a bunch of other cards that now you can extend, and more than likely you're going to OTK your opponent. This is ultimately why cards like Cyberjar are just way too broken and powerful, and that's why the card got banned and has been banned ever since. And overall, that's why this card is actually number 8 on this list. Number 7 on this list goes to Giant TRUNADE. Giant TRUNADE is a card that just simply says that all spell and trap cards on the field go back to the owner's hands. Now initially, the effect might actually seem weaker than a card like, Heavy Storm that has a similar effect, except it destroys the cards. In most cases, yes, Heavy Storm would actually be better because you're simply getting rid of the opponent's cards as opposed to just making them be able to play them again on their next turn. However, if you look deeper into this card, there are actually so many cards that you can abuse by just simply bouncing them to the hand, where you can generate so many combos and essentially replay cards. This card in combination with other cards that eventually got banned as well, such as Premature Burial, are reasons why the card has been actually banned and going back to limited over the last few years. Giant TRUNADE is a card that just simply has no drawbacks when it comes to bouncing spell and trap cards back, that nowadays, if you want to use an effect that bounces back row, it actually has a bit more of a cost, or at least it's a step-by-step thing to eventually lead to that effect. Giant TRUNADE is just way too simplistic with really no cost, and that's why this card is really up here on this list, because it's just way too good. Number 6 on this list goes to Mystical Space Typhoon. So, truthfully speaking, Mystical Space Typhoon technically isn't a better card than a few other cards I mentioned before, like Cyberjar or Giant TRUNADE, because the card is now unlimited. So obviously the card has been power crept by cards such as Twin Twisters, which is obviously much better, or even other ones such as Cosmic Cyclone. However, I thought that this card actually deserved to be up here on this list just because of its historical and iconic presence as to just how good the card actually was throughout the history of Yu-Gi-Oh! You see, when the card first came out, it was almost immediately limited to 1. However, it was never banned. Because it never went on the forbidden list, a lot of people actually complained that the card was just simply too powerful and should actually be rightfully forbidden. Now there's a lot of debate back and forth to see if it ever should have been, but ultimately Konami decided to never actually fully forbidden list the card. The card just became so iconic that pretty much every single deck out there in Yu-Gi-Oh! Had to run the card. It was limited, which means every single deck had one Mystical Space Typhoon. And it just became so popular that its acronym, MST, just honestly became kind of mainstream, and to the point where every single Yu-Gi-Oh! Player out there should know what MST means. It just became that iconic and famous. The number 5 card on this list goes to Confiscation. So this here is where the list is going to get absolutely ridiculous, because Spell Ruler is a booster pack that's known to have some of the most broken and cheap cards ever to be released in the history of the TCG. Confiscation is a card that says that for a cost of 1000 life points, you get to look at your opponent's hand and discard one of those cards to the graveyard. At first, the card might not seem overly powerful because you're paying 1000 life points to just get rid of one card in your opponent's hand, but if you look at it deeper, you'll see that there's actually a lot more to it. You see, looking at your opponent's hand is just simply way too good of an effect, which is why cards like Mind Crush and other similar effects like that for the longest time were just that good. Not really because of the entirety of its effect, but more so because it generated the advantage for you to actually be able to take a look at the cards that your opponent has. As I mentioned before with UPSTART Goblin, really just giving your opponent a 1000 life point bonus is much less of a cost than many other costs out there, which is why getting rid of a card in your opponent's hand and looking at the entire hand is just so worth 1000 life points. The card is just that good, and that's why it's been forbidden for the longest time. Funny enough, if you think this card is just utterly broken, you do not even know what's coming up next, because this is ridiculous. Number 4 on this list goes to Snatch Steal. So Snatch Steal has an effect that is honestly one of the most powerful effects ever, because simply any effect that has to do with stealing opponents' monsters is just way too good. That's why there's cards like Change of Heart and Brain Control and similar effects like that that are also just way too broken. You see, Snatch Steal is an equip spell card that can simply steal an opponent's monster, and every standby phase, well, they gain 1000 life points. I have to keep mentioning this whole plus 1000 life points or minus 1000 life points for you with UPSTART Goblin and Confiscation, because you're kind of noticing a trend here that during this time, Konami thought that Paying 1,000 or giving 1,000 to your opponent was actually balanced, considering the fact that you used a powerful effect. Quickly, however, players realize that 1,000 life points really has nothing of a cost when you are comparing it to other costs. And that's why Snatch Steal is just simply that good of a card, because for stealing your opponent's monster, you can then use it for like tribute fodder or maybe extra deck summoning plays and so on and so forth. And that's overall why this card is just simply too powerful and has also been on the ban list for the longest time now. Number 3 on this list goes to Delinquent Duo. So Delinquent Duo also says that you have to pay 1,000 life points, and then your opponent discards one card, but also one card is discarded randomly, which means your opponent actually loses 2 cards from your hand in exchange for you paying 1,000 life points. The card is pretty similar to Confiscation in that you pay 1,000 life points, but the difference is actually that in exchange for not looking at your opponent's hand, the cards are actually going to be random, in other words, the other card that's discarded. So Confiscation lets you look at the opponent's hand, and you get to discard one. Delinquent Duo does not let you look at the opponent's hand, but your opponent loses 2 cards, 1 card of their choosing and then 1 card randomly. Overall, they're pretty balanced when it comes to comparing themselves to one another, but when compared to the majority of cards in the game, they're obviously utterly broken. It's ridiculous, because when it comes to cards that just generate pure hand advantage, that's the easiest way to make your opponent lose as fast as possible. Delinquent Duo is just way too good, and personally I think the card is a tad bit better than Confiscation, which is why I had to put it above Confiscation. But that's overall why this card is actually number 3 on this list. Number 2 on this list goes to the Forceful Sentry. The Forceful Sentry has another similar effect in terms of generating hand advantage compared to Delinquent Duo and Confiscation. So the Forceful Sentry says that you get to look at your opponent's hand, select one card in the hand and return it to the deck. This card is by far the best of the 3 cards when it comes to Delinquent Duo and Confiscation. There's a reason why. For one, there's no 1,000 life point cost that Delinquent Duo and Confiscation has. Secondly, you get to look at the opponent's hand, just like Confiscation, but thirdly, the card actually goes into the deck as opposed to the graveyard. This is ultimately why the card is by far better than Confiscation, because it avoids the 1,000 life point cost, as well as sending the card to the deck and not discarding it. And when compared to Delinquent Duo, now yes, Delinquent Duo does actually get rid of 2 cards, but in many cases people would argue that the Forceful Sentry is just better, because the Forceful Sentry lets you look at the opponent's hand and then send the card to the deck as opposed to the graveyard, which in many cases is just much better, because it limits your opponent from actually utilizing that card if it had a graveyard effect. Graveyard effects are a lot more common than cards that have effects that go into the deck, of course, so that's why the card is just better. But yes, I really don't have to repeat it again, but the card is just ridiculously broken because of just how much advantage one single card can give you for pretty much no cost at all. And finally, the number 1 best card in Spell Ruler is Painful Choice. Many people regard Painful Choice to be the strongest card ever to be released, yes, even stronger than cards like Pot of Greed and Graceful Charity, for a number of reasons. The biggest reason is because in the right deck, Painful Choice can actually be a +4, whereas Graceful Choice and Pot of Greed don't even have that kind of advantage. Let me explain. So Painful Choice's effect says that upon activation, you get to select 5 cards, any 5 cards, and essentially show them to your opponent. Then your opponent chooses one of those 5 cards to add to your hand, and you send their other 4 to the graveyard. So when compared to other cards like, I don't know, maybe Foolish Burial, you can clearly see the power difference. Foolish Burial is a card that lets you select any one monster card, only monster card, and send it to the graveyard straight from your deck. And this effect, despite it not seeming so powerful, is actually a limited card, because the card effect actually is pretty powerful. There are just way too many really good graveyard effects in monsters that would just activate upon being sent there, or maybe special summoning themselves or something like that if they were to make Foolish Burial at 3, which is why they don't put it past 1. On top of that, technically speaking, that card is actually a -1. Even if you utilize the graveyard, technically speaking, it's a -1, so keep that in mind. Going on to Painful Choice, however, the card lets you select 5 cards, your opponent chooses 1, and then you send 4 to the graveyard. First of all, it lets you choose any cards. It's not just monster cards, but any cards. Secondly, you're essentially using 4 Foolish Burials in 1. Just think about that. Foolish Barrel, a card that they don't even let you put more than one copy in the deck. There's actually 4 of those in one Painful Choice, because you're sending 4 cards to the graveyard. And lastly, the card isn't even a -1, because after all, one of those 5 cards is going to your hand, so you're actually going neutral, so it's not even a -1. All of these effects are just simple reasons as to why Painful Choice is just utterly broken, because if you were to select 5 cards that all have graveyard effects, and then 4 of those have to be sent to the graveyard, you're actually going +4 with this effect, whereas Pot of Greed is more so like a +1. And that's why this card has been forbidden ever since and will never ever get off the forbidden list, because it's just way too good. The only way it will is if it somehow gets errated, kind of like what happened to Chaos Emperor Dragon Envoy of the End. But if it's not errated, there's absolutely no way that this card will ever come off the ban list. Alright, so that was it for the top 10 best spell ruler cards ever to be released. So once again, if you enjoyed the video, please be sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe if you're not done so already, as it does help both parties out. And as always, I will see you all in the next one. Bye bye everyone, have a great and of course a fantastic day.